Tonight we dive into the black market of babies during the Victorian era. In particular, one of Great Britain, going on the same time frame as the infamous Jack the Ripper. It was a grim time, especially if you were an unwed mother with no help and assistance, shunned by the community. A former nurse, midwife, a woman by the name of Amelia Dyer, earns the title of baby farmer as well as the angel of death. In a period spanning 20 years, she would kill between 300 to 400 infants and dispose of their bodies like rubbish, all for the sake of money. One of the world's most notorious and nightmarish serial killers of all time.
Spoiler alert, this one's not really for the squeamish.
Yeah, some dark times ahead.
From a child born into this world, we are taught what to believe. Closed-minded we become, fearful to be deceived. Still we desire to know what lies beyond that locked door. The art of the storyteller, conjuring tales of legend and lore. History hidden, lost knowledge, things forgotten and the unknown. These are the things that direct us and will set the tone. Welcome, friends, to another episode of Nightmares on the Lost Highway.
Before we get started on this one, I do want to have a disclaimer. We're going to use the term adopt or adoption from time to time. We understand that if you're selfless enough to adopt a child and take them into your care, that's a sacrifice that not everybody's willing to make.
God bless you.
But when we use that term today, especially in this particular instance, this is not adoption the way you understand it today. This is kind of a darker practice, if
Gritty,
you will.
dark, yeah.
So we don't want to. We're not disparaging adoption in any way, but that's just the terminology of the time, and so that word will come up.
And again, I want to kind of stress, if we have younger audiences out there, this one is probably not for the squeamish of heart.
Yeah.
And for the younger kids out there, just forewarning. Amelia Dyer, baby farmer. She was the youngest daughter of a large British family whose father was actually a master shoemaker. Now, she grew up in a well-established home, had a great education, reading, writing, she enjoyed poetry, seemed like a well-rounded family. These things would later help her sell herself as an established, reputable, well-rounded, trustworthy person. She often called herself Mrs. Scott in advertisements in the newspaper, not using her real name. It sounded established, the name, and it was a great alias. Now, during her teenage years to early 20s, she had held many reputable jobs. Learning from each one of these, it would prepare her in her desires. She served as a nurse, as a midwife, and even working in an asylum from time to time.
She did have a background in taking care of people, and I think that helped her in her, I don't know if we want to call it career, but her eventual life path here.
And again, trying to understand, I love to try to understand people. Maybe, when she started out, she had some, good features and some good things she was trying to accomplish. However, as you listen on in tonight's podcast, you're going to see where the train totally left the rails.
Well, if you see her photo online,
she's a rough-looking gal.
Looks like the evil head mistress of the orphanage out of every scary movie you've ever seen.
Yeah, right. We're going to kind of bounce around a little bit, but I call this kind of step one in catching a serial killer. We're going to talk about a governess, an unwed, 25-year-old barmaid. Her name is Evelina Marmon. Now, she's going to come up in the story from time to time and ultimately helps to catch the serial killer. But in January 1896, she gave birth to an illegitimate, beautiful, and healthy baby daughter that she named Doris.
I'd like to add, illegitimate, that's a phrase that'll probably come up in these stories quite a bit too. Obviously, these were different times, and children born out of wedlock, especially to house servants that might be the product of the man of the house.
Right.
A lot of that led to this practice that we're going to talk about. And so, again, like the very strict values in those days. So just having an illegitimate child in general was frowned upon.
Very much. Having a baby outside of wedlock during this time frame in the 1890s went against the ethics and the core and morals of society. Again, as Bill said, kind of different times. During this time frame, for an unwed woman to have a child was like a sentence. No one would hire you. You could not acquire any financial aid or help.
Yeah, you'd essentially become untouchable.
Yeah, and I mean, you did whatever you could do to survive and hopefully try to provide for your baby. Young mothers like this would often try to find help wherever they could, at best finding a babysitter of sorts that would allow them to acquire a job secretly. Others took the oldest of professions, becoming ladies of the night in the red districts of town. Previously, in England, if a child was born out of wedlock, the child and the mother got some protection by the law. If the father did not wed the mother, the local parish would then kind of step up and take place and provide for them.
There was a law passed at some point in the 1800s, late 1800s, and I don't remember the exact name, but it actually stripped certain protections away from the father. Like, he wasn't responsible.
However, in 1834, the practice was abolished, possibly thinking this was empowering and encouraging babies to be born out of wedlock, which obviously is something the church did not want. So when this infant girl Doris was born in 1896, 60 years later, to mother Evelina Marmon, they did not have that luxury. In doing this, the government essentially put all responsibility, moral, financial, and all others, to the woman, to the young mother. And without the aid of the parish, these single mothers were faced with dire circumstances to provide for the infants. So this young mother placed an inexpensive, tiny little advertisement in the local newspaper. It didn't cost much to do so. However, it would truly cost her everything, as it would take her and her infant daughter directly into the hands of the era's most notorious baby farmers of the Victorian age.
Now, I think we've used this term baby farming. I think we need to define that just a little bit before we go on. So the idea of baby farming was the historical practice of accepting into your custody an infant or a child in exchange for payment. This was late Victorian era Britain, and to a lesser extent Australia and the United States. But basically they would adopt children for a lump sum payment, or others would care for the infants for periodic payments. But basically you were paying someone to take your baby.
And that could be, like I said, not a term used back then, but a babysitting kind of stint, maybe for certain hours,
I think that's the way it
days,
was,
weeks.
At times, I think that's how it was used.
But often it become the word
because
adoption.
These people were paid with the understanding that care would be provided for the baby.
Mm-hmm.
But baby farmer actually became an insult pretty early on in this practice, and it was, if you were called a baby farmer, it was implied that you were not treating these children properly.
Definitely a very negative.
Again, illegitimate children were usually, quote unquote, put out to nurse, and to keep that stain off the family. These babies would disappear. It was like they were never there at all. It also, at the time, encompassed foster care and adoption before they were regulated by law in that area. So again, like I said, we're going to use the term adoption, but in this context, not great. Sometimes wealthy women would put infants out in the care of villagers. These well-to-do ladies didn't have time to take care of their own children. And
nursemaids and such.
The separation anxiety, it usually left long-lasting effects on these kids, even in the situations where, bad things didn't happen. Usually lump sum arrangements, honestly, it was more profitable if the baby farmer, if the infant died. Because they had to care for these children. They were given a lump sum payment, and then they had to care for the kid. And a lot of times that money wouldn't be enough to care for that kid for very long.
Mm-hmm.
And so they could actually make money if the children died. And so unfortunately that became, part of this. The payments usually weren't very much. I've got some money value here. Well-off parents that wanted to keep the birth a secret, they might pay as much as £80, which would be, adjusted for inflation and then converted to dollars would be about $14,600 today. Again, that's
not a lot to take care of for a child.
£50 if it was just the father wanting to keep things quiet, which would be about $9,100. Impoverished young women would actually, quote unquote, be charged to take their babies from them.
How gross is that?
£5 then, which would be the equivalent of about $910 today. The price of a baby, $910.
Yeah.
That's sad. And of course, like I said, some people resorted to starving these babies to save money. I mean, the $900, that £5 wouldn't go very far.
I actually read, to your point, like if they, we'll use the word adopted again, a young baby, they would take that money and go buy medicine to basically tranquilize said baby
Yeah, I've got that
until
here.
they starve to death.
Noisy or demanding babies would be sedated with alcohol or opiates. They had what they called Godfrey's cordial, also known as mother's friend, and it was just like a syrup that contained opium.
Opium.
The drugged children would have no desire to eat. They wouldn't be hungry. They just wouldn't eat. And coroner would often rule the death debility from birth, lack of breast milk, or just simply starvation.
One of the stories I had read, apparently this medicine didn't taste real well, so often the baby farmers would put honey or something sweet and then actually get the baby to suckle off the finger to take some of this. And they explained like a flat, an apartment where couches and beds would just be lined with babies that were sedated, waiting for them to die.
Kind of horrific. I mean, and again, not everybody that participated in this was that. Like you said, some of it was legitimate adoption. Some of it was like child care.
Right.
People, well-off people paying someone to take their baby born in shame, or the charging poor people to take their babies.
And they didn't have anywhere else to turn to. I mean, it was desperate times.
And we're going to charge you money to take your poor baby. And again, the £5 was probably way less than what it was going to cost to raise that baby. They were, impoverished. They were honestly probably coming out ahead.
Now, again, going back to Evelina Marmon, she had taken out a small newspaper ad, and the ad actually said, "Wanted, respectable woman to take young child at home. State terms to Mrs. Scott, 23 Manchester Street, Cheltenham, England." This was actually an ad that the two women would come together and meet, Evelina and the baby farmer. When she had put that tiny ad in there, she was looking for a good, reputable person or a family, not as an adoption, but simply somebody trustworthy as what we would use today as the term babysitter, allowing her to go get a job and help to provide. In this ad, literally, that's what brought the two women face to face, and she met literally the devil. She would be dubbed the Angel of Death. Mrs. Scott appears, which of course is Amelia Dyer, using her alias, at the doorstep and quickly presented herself as an aging, elderly couple, her and her husband, that lived in the country, could not have children of their own, and was getting on in life, so they wanted to adopt. When Evelina said she really wasn't wanting to adopt, the tables kind of got a little bit more frantic, and basically she was told, look, I may be the only chance you have. Sign over the rights to the baby, give me some money for doing this, and I will promise you she's going to be raised great in a country setting, well provided. The young lady, 25 years old, I guess felt that was probably her best option, hoping to provide a better family for her young daughter, Doris. And of course, that's not the way it worked out. She would actually make payments to Dyer for this.
Some arrangements weren't like a lump sum.
You
didn't pay all at once.
Yeah.
You paid periodically, and I would think those arrangements were probably more of the babysitting type.
Now, Evelina made Mrs. Scott promise that she would constantly update her with letters on how her daughter Doris was doing. She also said she could come and visit and see baby Doris. So everything seemed good. She did get a letter back from Mrs. Scott, Amelia Dyer, when they did arrive home, but that was the only letter that they would ever get back. This infant later would be found in a carpet bag, piled in with another little boy baby.
And floating in the river Thames.
Caught by a fisherman, happened to notice it. And this is where things start coming unraveled. Apparently, Mrs. Dyer, the baby farmer, had a system that she had developed through the years. And we're going to go back and kind of visit with what got her from point A to point B. But she also had traits as a tailor, working in seamstress. There was a tape that was used in making dresses that she would tie around the babies' necks to suffocate them. Not much more than a piece of lace, kind of a shoelace kind of thing that was tied around the neck. That kind of became her trademark. And when they started looking in the river where these baby infants were found, they started finding more and more with this tall tale sign of the ribbon tied around the neck.
If we've learned anything, if you're going to be a serial killer, you got to mix that up a little bit.
Yeah, that's not the same way you want to do anything.
Yeah, I think eventually she was arrested on April 4th of 1896. And this became one of the most sensational trials of the Victorian period. I mean, it was crazy. And yeah, it was the murder of that infant Doris Marmon that eventually she was found guilty of.
Baby Doris.
And she was one of a handful of baby farmers that was actually executed. And on June 18th, 1896, she was hanged. Now, in the course of her trial, only a handful of murders were actually attributed to her. But it is rumored she was responsible for possibly more than 400 deaths in her lifetime.
Yes.
And this was over, a 30-year period that she was caring for children. And again, I think you touched on it. This started out as, legitimately taking care of children, but she learned that if those children died in her care, she still got the money.
It became profitable.
Yeah, it became a profitable thing for her.
Yeah, there was, while having several notable jobs, especially as a nurse and a midwife, working the asylum, humble beginnings, I guess, if you would. She had met an elderly lady, as I understood, that was a fellow nurse while she was working as a nurse. And the society had kind of created a terrible issue by turning the parish church and everybody turning their back on these young mothers. Many of the hospitals, I understood, didn't even want to deliver the children.
Well, I would assume at the time a lot of hospitals were probably directly associated with the church. So
makes sense.
Yeah.
So this elderly nurse kind of asked Amelia Dyer for some help because she had opened up kind of a, if you will, a back alley midwife area. And she would help a lot of these mothers would come to her and deliver the babies because they could not go to the regular hospital. And I could see where this could have some semi-innocent beginnings. But what would happen is a lot of these women were so stressed out that literally after giving birth, they would just walk out and leave the child. Almost like escape out the door as fast as they could, leaving them with an infant.
And again, that's the product of the values of the time where these things were shamed. If you were an unwed mother, or again, if the father was part of a well-to-do family, he didn't want that stigma. It's just different values, different time period.
Well, then this kind of started adoption apartments, if you will. And so they would take out ads for people who did want to adopt. And again, you got to consider times were hard. Obviously, there were some wealthy families, but for the most part, the general class, it was all they could do to keep their own families, above poverty level. But she would offer, this nurse would offer what seemed like reasonable lodgings at a reasonable price for pregnant mothers. And however, once the unwanted infants would be born, they'd be passed through kind of a grim network of underground liquidation, black market sales.
Sounds awful.
Nasty. There was one particular woman by the name of Margaret Waters, and she seemed to kind of be one that would take care of a lot of the babies, but they would fade away very quickly of starvation.
And a lot of times it was just chalked up to accident, or
there wasn't a lot of rulings and laws, and quite honestly, this sounds horrible, but it wasn't important at the time.
Yeah.
Because these were people that were kind of, to be forgotten about anyhow.
Well, and she was believed to have killed at least 19 of these children. She was charged with 5 counts of willful murder, as well as neglect and conspiracy, and she was executed in 1870. Her sister was actually involved in that, too. And her sister was convicted in the same case for obtaining money under false pretenses, and she was sentenced to 18 months hard labor. So,
wow.
Some of these people did come to justice, but, it's unfortunate.
Too little,
it had
too
to
late.
happen.
Now, Amelia Dyer, she was smart enough to hide under her fake name. I'd already used Mrs. Scott. She had a couple other aliases, but Mrs. Scott was one of her favorites.
Well, my favorite alias is she eventually became dubbed the Ogress of Reading.
Ogress of Reading. She had learned with her jobs in the medical field how to stay ahead of the law, what the law would be looking for, how to escape around that. She had went back to some of those jobs before. Her husband lost his job like in 1887. She'd kind of pulled away from the baby farming and the apartments. But then when he started losing his income, of course, she had to step it up a little bit. So
you gotta do what you got to do.
You got to do what you got to do, yeah. So she hired some of these women to help take care of the babies and immediately started taking out ads in multiple newspapers, looking for adoption, acting like she was a reputable adoption, person that could be trusted at that time frame. She did go to jail, as you had said or mentioned. It was very short because nothing could really be proved except for negligence. But she quickly learned she did not want to return to jail.
Yeah.
One of the jobs, I believe, was they had to pick what looked like ropes, and their fingers would get all bloody. Her bed was literally a wooden bench with no cushions. And, I mean, she was a middle-aged woman at this time.
Yeah,
it wasn't comfortable for anybody.
She had gone to jail for this at least once before, she was executed, and attempted suicide even. So she survived at least one suicide attempt. Yeah, she didn't want to spend any time locked up.
Well, and she also had quite an addiction to opium. I don't know if it was
I think that was fairly common at that time.
I don't know if she was maybe battling some of her own demons trying to hide it. She was around it, as we said, giving versions of opium to the infants to keep them quiet. Laudanum was basically an opium medicine. And ironically, this was before pain pills. And so if you had an ailment, a pain, you could get this laudanum over the counter. It was cheaper than alcohol. I mean, here's opium being sold over the counter legally for just about anything that you wanted to use. No real laws about it. And so she started taking the opium.
It reminds me of a joke I heard somewhere. It was like, the 1800s were a wild time. It's like, oh, you don't feel good? Do some cocaine about it.
But she would become a total addict to this. And eventually, maybe that's kind of what got her to make some of her sloppy mistakes that ultimately got her caught. She had become a master of dodging the law. Every year or so, she would bounce around to a different area, move in Britain, usually within a 100-mile radius or so. She ran under several different alias names when she took out her advertisements in the newspaper. She had hired some people of, shall we say, ill repute to handle a lot of the day-to-day duties, which could be disposing of baby bodies. It could be drugging the infants until they starved to death. At some point in time, it was even brought up, although not proven, when people started getting close to her, her husband and some other people would take them out and stage it to look like possibly Jack the Ripper's victims, which was going on at the same time, which may have fueled Jack the Ripper as if he wasn't bad enough already. But with her background in the medical field, in particular an asylum, she had a tendency to hide in plain sight. She would fake her own mental illnesses, again, because she'd worked at an asylum. She was a nurse. She knew what the checklist was. She would check herself in to hide, lay low for a while in an asylum. And that was a much better conditions than what the prison and stuff was. So then when things would kind of calm down, she would self-unmedicate or whatever she needed to do, check the boxes, and check herself back out and start over again. She also stopped letting a lot of the people take care of the business herself. She took business into her own hands. She herself said that she started disposing of the infants because, again, I mean, the more people involved, the bigger the chain there is for the weaker links. She rescued a Granny Smith from the poor farm, an elderly lady. And again, these poor farms were not luxurious. But she went in and found her that she had some knowledge of midwifing, so took her under her wing to help her with her enterprise.
You got to forgive me here. This just popped into my head completely unbidden. You say she rescued this Granny Smith.
Granny Smith.
And based on the story and where we know this all ends up, is that why we call those particularly tart apples the Granny Smith?
I wondered, seriously, it went across my mind. I was like, I wonder if there's any connection here. Now, this 90-year-old woman, again, was rescued from the poor farm. She was smart enough to know what was going on. She didn't know how, but she understood there was piles of baby clothes that would stack up, correspondence letters where a dyer would put out these newspaper ads. And then, of course, there was correspondence back and forth with mothers. Again, she started getting a little sloppy, maybe due to being addicted to opium. She would move and leave all this stuff at her former house. So the police would come, find all these letters of correspondence about children, find all these stacks and stacks of baby clothes. And they said one of the houses that she had left, the stench of death was so extreme. Now, they didn't find any bodies or anything, but it was just the fact, literally, that they were drugging these infants and they were starving them to death.
I see the baby clothes thing comes up in a couple of the other baby farming stories. There's only so much you can do, right? You got to dispose of your evidence somehow.
Yeah, and why wouldn't you, burn the clothes, donate them, do something.
In one of the stories, I think one of the ladies gave away some of the baby clothes to a little girl to use as doll clothes. And then her mom happened to recognize those clothes as belonging to a baby that had been put up for adoption. So,
start connecting the dots.
Yeah.
Well, and early on, before she went to jail for that negligent, she was trying to do things legit. And I have to wonder what her sanity and mind thought was early on. She was going to the doctors and getting birth certificates when babies would be born, and then getting death certificates when the babies died.
Eventually, though, she stopped involving
She
the authorities.
stopped doing that for obvious reasons. But yeah, one of the doctors, when she was being put on trial, came forward and said, I did think it was a little odd that, there was like 100 infant death certificates requested in a period of like 4 months. That is like, what?
That doesn't throw up any red flags. Yeah,
it's like, how does this, and why would you do this? I didn't get it. So she got to be quite elaborate at dodging the law. We kind of touched upon it. The fall, where she finally actually got caught. Local fisherman finds a carpet bag, which, for those of you who may not be familiar, that's an older term. Yeah. Imagine kind of like a bowling ball bag, a little bit larger. It was a heavy duty bag, usually made out of a woven carpet style pattern. These would be used by many professions and stuff. It's a pretty common item, but it would be big enough that you could put like 2 infant bodies in at a time.
That is not a measurement I ever thought I would hear used. Yeah. That's big enough to hold 2 infant bodies.
That's creepy.
Blech.
She also had another trait that she did for whatever reason. She would wrap the infants in newspapers or papers that she had around the house. And this was one of the things that helped get her caught.
Well, I was going to say that'll definitely help pinpoint.
Found a partial address where she had led, and that led them to the house that I had mentioned that they said the morbid rancidness smell of death. And they found all the baby clothes stacked up and the correspondence letters. The house address was checked. She'd already left. But because of all of this stuff, the police were on to her. They also had started dragging the river, if you will, for other bodies, which they found many, mostly, again, with that seamstress tape wrapped around their throats. As the bodies began to accumulate, it was obvious what was going on. So the police themselves put an ad out in the newspaper, portraying themselves as a single mother, trying to get help with an infant, offering an equivalent of about $500 in today's adoption fees. They said they didn't want to be too extreme that it would, shock her to get her not to come, but not so cheap that she wouldn't come. And sure enough, it works. In the cover of darkness, Amelia Dyer responds. She goes out to meet what would be the police, and she goes into custody. And you had mentioned the trial. I think it lasted 1 day. She tries to proclaim insanity. Her own brother testifies against her.
You got to admit, that's the sort of crime that you don't mess around with. That's awful. 4
minutes, I was told, in deliberations, they find her guilty and sentence her to death.
And again, she's found guilty of the murder of baby Doris, but a 30-year span is possibly more than 400 victims.
Yeah. And usually, let's face it, those body counts are usually on the lower side. So yeah, I think there would probably be at least 400. We'll put it that way. But yeah, baby Doris was obviously one of the infants that they originally found by the fishermen. And this was sad. The police had contacted the mother of baby Doris and said, could you come to the police station? We have your baby.
Oh, man.
She's thinking,
yeah,
the baby Doris is alive and
that's
well.
That's awful.
She goes, they say, follow me down the hall. They take her to the morgue, and she identifies the body.
I can't imagine.
That's obviously she was crushed, but it was because that woman stood up, at that time frame, Evelina Marmon, 25-year-old woman, unwed, having a baby. As we were talking before the podcast, if you had speculation something was going on, you're not really going to go forward because what you did was kind of black market.
Yeah, a lot of the women involved in this, if they wanted to reclaim their babies or see their babies and they couldn't for whatever reason, they were very, I don't know that a phrase is the right word, but loath to go to the police.
Yeah.
Because they were already involved in something kind of shady as it was.
And you
didn't want to advertise your shame. Hey, I had this baby out of wedlock and I gave it up and now they won't let me see it. So again, the numbers on this, who knows? Who knows how bad it was?
Evelina Marmon, for whatever reason, made a point to take a stand. Here's that example of one person can make a difference. And by her constantly going and harassing, maybe that's not the right word, but going to the police, bringing attention to it, some of the newspapers picked up stories about it. It pulled that doctor back out that had issued, 100 death certificates and built a very solid, very quick case. Too little, too late, unfortunately. But I could not imagine being called up to the police department thinking you're going to go pick up your infant. And then to make matters worse, they said, at the time frame, the best that they could, baby Doris probably was killed within hours of leaving her mother's house. So
terrible.
Dyer didn't even attempt to take care of her.
So we have Amelia Dyer here, the Ogress of Reading, and we do eventually have her being executed for her crimes, but there were some other notable names in England and Britain. You have Amelia Sack and Annie Walters. They were both executed in 1903, and they were known as the Finchley baby farmers. Amelia, roughly around 1900, began to advertise that babies could be left with her and took money for taking them in. The clients were mostly servants from local houses who had become pregnant under mysterious circumstances. I think it goes back to our earlier conversation.
Yeah.
And they were always keen to resolve the matter discreetly. The charge for her to take a baby was between 25 and 30 pounds, which would be $4,200 to $5,000 today. She would collect the baby after it was born, and then would use chlorodyne, a medicine that contains morphine, to dispose of the babies. Her landlord happened to be a police officer, and happened to notice that this woman was constantly taking in babies, but didn't have any babies. Maybe if your landlord's a cop, you don't get involved in shady activities.
Not so much on the background checks there.
So that was her eventual downfall. No number was given for her. They don't know how many babies were died in her care. The last baby farmer to be executed in Britain was Rhoda Willis. She was hanged in Wales in 1907, the only woman to be hanged in Wales, actually. She was sentenced to death for murdering the illegitimate child of a single woman named Maud Treasure. Now, she was lodging with a Mr. and Mrs. Wilson in Cardiff, and she encouraged them to take part in this adoption process. She said, you should take in babies, and they'll pay you for it, and you make money doing it. And
it's a great job.
Yeah,
Sign up today.
Job. Now, apparently, Rhoda liked her drink. She came home drunk one day, and trying to get into bed, she apparently missed, fell out of bed. Mrs. Wilson went in to help her and found a dead baby wrapped in a bundle in the bed with her.
Oh, gosh.
It was clear that the baby had been suffocated, and apparently Rhoda had taken in this baby for the price of £6, which would be about $1,100 today. She was executed by hanging at Cardiff on August 14th of 1907 on her 40th birthday. That's a heck of a way to celebrate your birthday.
Happy birthday.
And like I said, the only woman to be hanged in Wales in the 20th century.
This is one of those topics that just kind of makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Well, I don't know how anybody could be so hardened.
Well, what's crazy is this is such a common thing that in Scandinavian countries, they actually have a name for it. Now I have here the Swedish word, which is Änglamakärska, and I'm sure that I said that right.
It sounded great.
But that means female angel maker.
Female angel maker.
It's such a thing. Like I said, they have a name for it. It's horrible. It's horrible. Like you said, you can't imagine somebody doing it.
Disgusting.
There was an undercover investigation on baby farming conducted in 1870, and the conclusion was, and I quote, "My conviction is that children are murdered in scores by these women, that adoption is only a fine phrase for slow or sudden death." The UK Parliament was moved to act, and they began to regulate baby farming in 1872. spurred by the investigation. Obviously, we still have people being hung in the 1900s, so they
It didn't go away. But
didn't move as fast as they should have. But eventually, they passed the Infant Life Protection Act. An important figure that was involved in this was Athelstan Braxton Hicks, which, if you're familiar with labor,
Yep,
I'm sure his name means something. He was a London coroner, actually, but he gave evidence in 1896 to the dangers of baby farming. One case was a Mrs. Arnold who had been sweating, quote unquote. I'm not sure exactly what it means, but she had been sweating infants illegally by just taking one at a time, and so remained under the radar. A jury in the case later added the opinion that the jury are strongly of opinion that further legislation in what are usually known as baby farming cases is greatly needed, and particularly that the required legislation should extend to the care of one infant only, and that the age of the infant should not be limited to 1 year, but rather to 5, and that it should be an offense for any person undertaking the care of such an infant to sub-farm it. So, after this had become quite a thing, after the big show of the Dyer trial, they really kind of started to step in and say this is something that should be regulated, and eventually would become the foster and adoption system that they have today. Like I said, adoption, when we use it in this context, is horrific. Now, these were just terrible, terrible people to do what they did.
Yeah. And society, the world, obviously kind of created the perfect place for these monsters. They wanted to be forgotten. The people didn't want to be forgotten, but society wanted to forget the people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was a perfect petri dish there that we're not going to look that way. We're going to turn a blind eye. They kind of created this, so obviously it was good that we learned from our mistakes. Yeah. Unfortunately, at a terrible, terrible cost of life. I don't even know what else to say on this one. I think truly this is one of those tales of nightmares.
Oh, yeah.
On the Lost Highway, for sure. We thank you for listening in. We hope that you did enjoy the podcast, and thank you for your continued support. Would like to give a shout out to our first paying sponsor, Raven's Loft. That's our family shop here located in Lebanon, Missouri. It's your one-stop gaming, vintage toy, and collectible shop where you can find Star Wars, Transformers, G.I. Joe, comics, vinyl records, role-play gaming, Magic the Gathering, and so much more. We're located here at 223 West Commercial, downtown Lebanon, and also in our second location, also here in Lebanon at the Heartland Antique Mall. We'd like to thank Raven's Loft for, again, supporting Nightmares on the Lost Highway.
I want to take a time to thank the people that helped bring this all together. Alex Tudor, you can almost call him our producer at this point. Sarah Tudor, who also helps with some of the technical stuff. I want to take a moment to extend thanks to Eric for letting us use his space to record in, kind of our makeshift studio.
I, in turn, would like to thank Bill for, one, putting up with me and using this camaraderie to do something we both very much love and enjoy doing, and thank Bill's family for allowing him to spend all the time to work and clean up our recordings and present them in what you hear in the final terms, the final edition, if you will.
And I'd like to thank all of you for continuing to listen. I know we've got some loyal followers out there. We do this as a labor of love, but we're happy that there are people that enjoy it hopefully as much as we do.
Thank you very much.